Pablo. He is a English teacher, and he also was my English teacher in a period of my life. So I am very happy and very glad that Juan Pablo is joining us today. So Juan Pablo, please could you give us a really short introduction about your career?
Well, good evening, everybody. My name is Juan Fajardo. I'm an English teacher. I have been an English teacher practically for 12 years. I started when I was 18 years old, giving private classes. And since I was 23, 24 years old, I started teaching actually in schools. I have taught English and natural sciences in English, and all this time, literature. I have talked to kids from 8 years old to 85 years old.
That's a big resume. So
Thank you.
thank you for that. And I think we should start right now. So, first question, what do you think is the relationship between language and culture?
Well, we first have to think that language is an expression of culture because language is the necessity, what covers the necessity of people in order when they need to communicate. So this necessity of communication creates culture because culture is precisely this understanding of what is happening in society, both in the physical term and in the terms of what the society considers important, both mentally, morally. So all this culture becomes the language of a city or of a certain people on earth.
Okay, thank you. Next question, what is the influence of culture in the process of a foreign language process?
Well, when you're learning a foreign language, first you need to understand that this new language you're learning is another way to see life. So, for instance, just a little something in Spanish, yo tengo hambre, but in English it's not something you have. So it's another way of seeing what is necessary. For instance, when you're learning languages like German, which use capital letters in different ways, um, it's necessary to understand, culturally speaking, the way these people conceives life and how this changes the way the language applies and how the language is developed. That is the first point.
Okay, so we should say that the main influence of language and culture in this process could be the main tool of a culture to make understand other people how are they, for instance, their way to live, their way to dress, their way to act.
Exactly. As we discussed in the first question, um, language is an expression of the culture, so it's impossible to separate them both. In the moment we are learning from another culture, we are learning from another language, we are learning the way this culture sees the world and how even us as learners are different from them. So it's totally impossible to separate those two aspects.
Okay. Next question. So, which cultural expressions do you know countries have through language?
Okay, I would like to refer to two really special ones, which I really like and I use really often. The first of them is the expression in English, "I am feeling blue." Um, when you say in English you're feeling blue, you're feeling sad, and you think of all this baggage about all the music we have in which black people started singing blues songs in which they were moaning about how their lives as slaves and as segregated people in the United States in the 50s was. This actually conveys and compacts really interesting aspects of the English culture, especially in the fact that sadness was accommodated to a color, which was then accommodated to a genre of music, and everything became just a single thing, which is to be feeling blue. And another second option that I use a lot is the word deutlich in German. Deutlich means logically, but Deutsch is the first part of Deutschland, Germany in German. So technically, you're saying when you say something is logically happening in English, you're saying it's Germanally happening. So that is quite interesting how they conceive themselves as from language and up, they to be really, really logical.
I didn't know that reference about blues, and I think that's a very interesting reference. And thank you for sharing that with us today because it is really impressive. I didn't know about that. It's really really cool that reference.
Absolutely a pleasure.
Thank you. Next question. Why do you think it's important to have an oral tradition in a country?
Oral tradition in any single culture is exactly the expression of what the people are thinking in their normal lives. The written part is regularly academic, but what we say in the streets, what we do with our language while speaking, while nobody's watching, while we are only with our closest friends and they understand that, that becomes oral tradition. Let's remember that in some other cultures, like for instance, Huitoto culture here in Colombia, um, written tradition doesn't exist, and actually everything is oral. I had the pleasure in National University to study with one of the only speakers of Murui language left here in Colombia. And his oral tradition, his understanding of the world, is actually based on how he speaks and to whom he speaks. So oral tradition is actually the basis of his whole culture. And understanding his stories is understanding the way of his life. So in that precise culture, oral tradition is everything. In a culture like really occidental, like our culture, our oral tradition is also the way we communicate with the people we hold closer to our hearts. So oral tradition is actually the expression of our endearments, of the love we feel for people, and for the way we conceive life in our normal days, not in the academic, but as people in real life. So that is important.
Okay. I also didn't know about the Witoto part of the oral tradition, and I think I'm learning a lot about this interview.
Really glad to do.
Next question. What do you think? Do we teach language using culture, or we teach culture using language?
I guess we cannot actually say which we do because as we have come to analyze, both are the same thing. Language is part of culture, so we cannot teach one without the other or one through the other. Maybe one of the things that we do is that sometimes we search for equivalents in our languages and in our cultures. And I guess one of the important things is to make the students realize that precisely that when we're learning a language, we are not learning actually just a mix of words that together are sounding a certain way, but that actually we are learning another way to see life and another way to express reality. Another example that I put a lot with Witoto language, for instance, is that Witoto has two words for the verb to die. One, excuse my dog, sorry. Well, actually, Witoto has two words for the verb to die. One of the verbs is actually the same verb you used to talk about the death of a flower or to wither, marchitarse in Spanish, and the other one actually means to die in war. But there's actually a big difference between them two. Witoto language has five verbs for eating. So it depends on this, on the flavor of what you're eating, on the texture, on if it sounds or if it doesn't, or if it is sacred or not. So actually, in order to learn how to use those five verbs, you need to understand the rituals of that culture. In Spanish, we need to understand the difference between when we are offending and when we are being endearing with other people. And excuse my words, but I especially refer to the word marica in Spanish because if you see somebody in the street and you want to be offensive, you can call him "hey, marica," and that is offensive. But your best friend, you see him and oof, marica, time
Hey,
to see
Marita.
you. So actually,
Yeah.
culturally speaking, you cannot say marica is actually an offense, but you cannot say it's actually an endearment because it's both things and you need to learn how to use it. So, in order to learn a language, we need to know the culture, and in order to learn a culture well, we need to understand the language.
Okay. And last but not least, do you take into account culture in the strategies you use in your English classes? Can you give me some examples?
Yes, actually, it's one of the most important things to do because let's take a little example which is pretty common and which we happen to see a lot in books, in academic books. For instance, we in Colombia go and buy a book to learn English, and in the book it says Jonathan or Mr. Marlborough went and bought a book, and it was £6. Okay, first of all, we don't have anybody called Mr. Marlborough here. Second, we buy books in pesos, and that's it. Another part of this book could say something like, today we're gonna prepare a typical dish of this place, and it's going to be, I don't know, fish and chips, which is something absolutely not typical here in Colombia, or which is typical only in one place. So for a student, it's not going to be easy to understand that how come a person pays only £6 when for us is something like 50,000 pesos, like 50,000 compared to six. So they are not gonna get a real idea of what we are doing and what we are learning. People talk about the, I don't know, that is just a little aspect. In another second aspect that maybe we can think is the difference in Spanish that we have two genders, while in English we have just the neutral gender. And add to that mix that, for instance, in German they have three genders: masculine, feminine, and neutrum, and in Spanish, masculine and feminine, and in English, the, period. So we need to understand when to tell a student, hey, be careful, because uh, in Spanish, a student tends to confuse a and an with un and una. And if we don't know that they speak when something that takes into consideration masculine and feminine, we don't know how to stop them from making this mistake. Hey, wait a second, it doesn't mean anything with the gender. It's actually just for the sound of the vowel or something. So if we understand, we can tackle some of those problems. And there are infinity of other situations that we can think about. For instance, German and Icelandic being agglutinant and semi-agglutinant, while English is totally separatist. So we cannot tackle this. Um, Spanish considering verbal conjugation in person and in number, while in English it only conjugates in number in some aspects. So if we don't understand this difference between these two languages and these two cultures, it's going to be quite difficult to actually get to a good explanation of a language.
Okay, so I think that's it. Uh, Thank you for your answers. I really appreciate your time here. I don't think that anybody could be better for this interview.
Thank you so much. It's
I
been a
really
pleasure.
appreciate really appreciate that, and I hope to see you again in some space to talk about something interesting that could help a lot other people and also me that I'm in this process of learning this beautiful career. So
Thank you so
thank you,
much.
and see you soon. Goodbye.
See you soon. Be good. Keep learning. And thank you so much for having me here. Bye bye.
Thanks.